Hello, my name is Zoe. Welcome to the creative tutorials for ACM Studio. This is our concept art workshop. We first ran this workshop in person during week 3 of the fall quarter of 2022, but this is the recorded version. And since it is a workshop, you are invited to sketch or draw along as much as you want. And I would recommend for that to pause the video when needed, because I will just be kind of going through all of the slides. Unfortunately, I am not in person, so I will not be there with you to give feedback as I did when we ran this workshop in person, but feel free to still use the resources and to post your work onto the ACM Studio Discord if you feel so inclined. So the warm-up that we ran, which feel free to pause in a few seconds for a few minutes if you want, was to start doodling a character, prop, or environment inspired by food. And here are some inspiration images that we came up with. Feel free to use these. Feel free to use your own reference images. But if you want to pause the video now, then you can proceed and do your warm-up, and then you can just unpause when you're ready. Okay, we will move on now. So what is concept art is kind of the first question that we need to address here. And especially what is concept art in terms of the game industry. So concept art is visual representation of a project's style or look used to create the creator's vision. So it is a tool, sort of more than a finished super polished rendering necessarily. It is used to, in order for the creative team to sort of start making decisions about how the game will look once it actually is all implemented. And not only is this a tool for the creative director to see what the concept artists have come up with, or any other person in a producing or managerial role within the game development studio, but also for the artists who will be working on the actual graphics for the game, to sort of have a jumping off point. So these will usually be different artists than the ones who create the concept art, and then the graphics artists, whether they're 3D modelers or 2D artists, will then take those ideas and translate them into sprites and animations and models that can be used in game. So concepts can range from anything from weapon sketches to environment paintings, early character art, even storyboards can be considered concept art. And it really should make sense for a game's visual style. And what I mean by that is that the concept must reflect what the game is intended to be in the end. So for example, if your game is going to be a 16-bit pixel art game, then it might not be appropriate for the concept artist to then create fully rendered, hyper-realistic renderings of characters or props or environments or whatever that are never actually really going to be used in that way in the actual game. So that type, that highly rendered, highly realistic concept art is more appropriate for, say, AAA quality 3D game that has, like, really realistic 3D modeling in it. Whereas for those 2D games, the concept art is often going to be, as we'll see a little bit later, pretty much usually very close to what actually goes up in the game, just a less polished version. And so concept art, the really main thing that we need to understand is that it is about iteration. So we're generating many ideas for the team to choose from and work off of. So don't just settle for one version of your idea. Give people things to choose from and to decide between, whether that's different color variations, different sort of elements or shapes, or whatever it is. And we'll see some examples of that in just a bit. Examples. So I chose a couple of different examples of character concept art that are from two very different styled games. The first one is from Hades. These are some early protagonist iterations that the concept team came up with. What's really interesting here to note is the perspective used in this piece is that it is a sort of isometric perspective looking down at the character, which is really important because Hades, if you've never played the game, although I'm sure many of you have, it is a game that's played in isometric perspective. So you are controlling the main character Zagreus as you're looking down at him, and any other character art that's not that appears as just like a static sprite usually. But the main times that we see the character, he is from that isometric perspective. And you can also see the iteration, how, you know, in one version he has like this sort of hood that didn't really appear in the final game. And then beside him is what, before Zagreus existed, they were going through these ideas of having the game be about Theseus going through the labyrinth. And so that's what that version on the right of that image is showing. So that really shows you how concept art can really guide and change the direction of the story even, or like the whole gameplay, which is something that's really interesting about the creative process. And on the other hand, on the right here, we have some more realistic, you know, very detailed renderings that look very polished from Horizon Zero Dawn. And these were like NPC concepts. And you can see just the level of texture and detail that goes into them. And that's because these are going to be translated into very high realistic, high poly 3D models. Whereas Zagreus in Hades, he was translated into a 3D model because the game is sort of a like 2.5D, but his model was very simplified to give it that, and painted over to give that sort of like 2D-esque look. Whereas in Horizon Zero Dawn, these are meant to be very highly realistic 3D models of these characters and props. And so that's why there's, you know, a lot of attention to realistic proportions and drapery and details and texture that is going to be really important for the 3D models, the 3D model artists to work off of. Similar vein environment. So on the left here, I gave you these just amazing, I love these environmental thumbnails from Hollow Knight. I really wanted to contrast these two images because of how different they are, but they each work for what the game needs. For the Hollow Knight one, these are just pencil sketches, pencil and pen on a piece of paper. You know, it doesn't need to take much more than that, but you can see how much it informs the game's style and even the level design. As you can see, especially that one on the bottom right, shows like a pretty good chunk of the platforming level and what it will work with. So they're also kind of thinking, and especially on an indie game where, you know, that might have a smaller team and people are performing a lot of these roles, they're really working through a lot of things with their sketches, and but still having these ones that are very detailed as well, but still capture these really important shapes and not getting too much into the minutia of like color and everything. Whereas on the right, we have Horizon Forbidden West, which this is a fully rendered painting, which, you know, you could, that's gorgeous, you know, you could hang it up on your wall. But even so, it's still a tool. And this, you know, this is a very big game with a very big team, and likely a lot of producers that they needed to present the concepts to as well, for them to sign off on. So giving a very detailed and specific you know, sort of view of what the game might look like is very helpful here, especially if you're presenting to, you know, some higher ups that might not necessarily have an art background to really be able to dissect anything beyond what they're seeing right in front of them. Which I'm not saying that all directors are like that, but as somebody who works with directors, some of them really do need it spelled out for them. So always have that in mind. But yeah, so these Horizon ones are like, this is a sort of quality, or not necessarily quality, but just style of, highly rendered concept art that you'll see in the film industry as well. And then props and details, very fun things to do as well, and should not be neglected. This one on the left, both of these I found from an article on concept art that had a bunch of different links to a bunch of different artists. The links for the sources that I found these and the other examples from are in the shared docs, which should be shared with you as well as this video. They're in the notes. So if you want to take a look at that, I highly recommend. But this one on the left is this sort of like robot creature or, mechanic that you can really see how there's different iterations and different angles slightly. And that what I really love about this one is that the full sheet, the full spread is laid out very nicely, where you have some more detailed renderings that are only done in a couple of colors just to show, value and shape. And then you have this one that's more rendered and full and colored and textured to give the overall. And again, like notes, handwritten notes, always super helpful, especially when pointing out all those little details that might not be immediately recognizable. And that's something that can be very, very important when laying out a spread like this as well. And then these rock explorations on the right, gorgeous. And what I want to point out, similar thing is, you have some less detailed iterations, and then they've pulled out specific forms that they wanted to render a bit more. You can see on the rocks at the bottom how they're only playing with light and shadow, really focusing on the shape and form before getting into too much detail. And another really important thing with that one, since it is an environmental prop, although this is true for, any prop as well, is that there's a human for scale. And that's really important in games, because your scale in games is always built off of the character, the player character, because that is sort of who you'll be seeing, even if whether the game is in, first person or third person, you will be seeing everything that you see in the game, for the most part, will be contextualized through that character. And so it's really important that even in your concept art that you have just a little, just a little figure for scale, so that people know, like, those rocks could be smaller, but we can see now, based on the figure, that they're quite huge. And then you can also use your concept art to storyboard and capture some emotion and tone as well. I've pulled out Hollow Knight again because I just love this painting that the artists did, where you can really get a sense of the color palette and the mood. And what I also love about it is that it's very much in the style of the game. Even the like horizontal ground that the character is standing on is reminiscent of sort of a platform. So you're sort of, again, viewing contextualized through the game itself and how it will be eventually, which is really helpful for showing in art, because obviously your concept art is not the game, but we'd want to make it feel as much like the game, which is a world that you can explore as much as possible. And then I couldn't go without including one of my favorite games, Gris. It is a really wonderful platformer that I really love, and really relies a lot on emotion and story and character. And so you can see how, like, the main character with her big dress, which is the main mechanic of the game if you've never played it, is featured in all these storyboards and showing that movement, showing some of the scale as well in some of the environments. And you can really see like the use of just basic blocking in shadows and value can really do a lot to show you what direction something is going. So I really love these two examples as well. Okay, and so now to give you a few more somewhat specific tips on how to actually approach concept art now that you know what it is, have a greater idea of, some examples of it. So I like to start with gathering research. I think visual reference is very vital to any artistic endeavor, but especially for something that you really want to make sure that it's translatable into something else, whether that's a 3D model or 2D character sprites and animations. You really want to know where all those pieces fit together, if that makes sense. Like, for example, since my background is in costumes, having a knowledge of how clothes work and are pieced together is really helpful when I'm doing a character design, because then I can draw the lines to be where they need to be to suggest how the clothing functions. And that is so helpful for an animator, especially who, needs to know might need to know how that fabric moves, how the clothing reacts to the body. So the more that you know about the subject that you're trying to draw, the better that it will communicate the better your drawing will be able to communicate, if that makes sense. And once again, consider the needs of your project. Are there lots of characters? Who's the main character? Are they having to stand out or fade into the background? Do you have a whole bunch of settings? Is there historical accuracy that you need to pay attention to? Like, for example, you can just imagine the amount of research that, like, the Assassin's Creed concept art team went through, since a lot of them have, all of them, all those games have historical settings, and a lot of them are quite accurate in certain areas. So yeah, just be thinking of that while you're gathering your research and throughout the entire process as well. And then also choose an appropriate medium. A lot of times we have, concept art digitally. That's kind of like the main way that especially a lot of these industries sort of work. But you can also see, like in that one Hollow Knight image, that pencil sketches do work, on straight up pen and paper, work for many things. And even within your like broader medium of digital art or painting or whatever, figuring out what specific tools work best for you in order to best create your vision and make it come to life. And then in that vein, sort of exploring style, especially if there are any already proposed aesthetics or themes that your team has come up with that it makes they make you adhere to. That's especially true if you're working on something that's in a franchise or already established IP, because you'll have to be familiar with those aesthetics as well and know when to deviate and when to stick to them. And then also just have fun with color palettes, details, and shapes. This is, again, the iteration phase, so really anything goes at this point to some extent. So this is the time to get out the bad ideas and find the good ones hidden in there. Some more tips and tricks. Again, sketches, like, don't think that everything has to be like a fully rendered painting. Keep it loose to begin with. You don't need to start with color in the beginning. And I would recommend, like, when you're first dealing with those concepts, to focus on shape and form, and the expression, the gesture, because those are the things, especially in character art, where the silhouette of the character can really determine whether or not that they're a standout character or not. I would recommend looking in, if you're more curious about that subject, looking into animation character design, and how a lot of those have exaggerated silhouettes, because shape is really important. But that's kind of a tangent. But again, these sketches are a good place to start before moving into your more detailed work. But also great on their own to include in your concept package that you present. In person, I had some books to show that I passed around, and I referenced. I have an art book from Dragon Age Inquisition, and It has tons of great concept art in it, and some of them are just, pencil sketches, really loose. Some of them really, look like they probably took 30 seconds to do. And, those are also useful for your producers or your artistic director or your animators to see. Although I wouldn't rely on them exclusively because that just makes everybody else's job harder. Photo bashing is another great tip for getting that highly realistic look. This is a technique very often used in the film industry. And as an example of that, on the right, I have a piece done by me for a concept art class that I took last year, which was used photo bashing in Photoshop and then painting over it in Photoshop as well. So essentially, I drew the shape of the room and the windows and the major shapes, but everything else to get like the textures specifically, all the books and some of the furniture as well. Those were images that I took and cropped and then edited to be in the right color palette and painted over when needed to give the lighting effects. So it was about like, this one in particular, I think was a little bit more painting than photo bashing how it ended up, but it was very, it made it a lot faster and a lot better looking to be able to use those real textures and real shapes. It can make up for a lot of time that is spent in making these really highly realistic pieces. And then also, like I showed you in some of those prop examples, sort of zoom in on details when needed. So you might draw something on a belt buckle, for example, that when you draw it in the full rendered image, it's a bit small or squiggly. But if it's like a really important detail, like it has, like a figure on it that's, symbolic or, is whatever, you can just draw that on a larger scale by itself and write a little note. That is super helpful, especially for anything that's like a really pertinent detail that you might not be able to draw in super clear detail in the scale that you're working for the whole overall image. Okay, so this is the workshop portion. We do have a couple more slides that I went through halfway through the workshop when we ran this in person. So stick around for those if you don't want to do any of your own drawing. But if you do, you should pause the video coming up. And we gave you a few prompts to choose from, but you, of course, can do whatever you want during this time, work on it for however you want. And if you really feel proud of what you worked on, go ahead and drop it in the Discord. We have channels for sharing your work, so we'd love to see it, and you can get some feedback if you want. So I really recommend doing that. But you can pause for now, and then when you're ready to unpause, I just have a few more tips. Okay, now that you've unpaused, we're going to move on. So some additional tips and resources. This is not an exhaustive list. Again, this workshop's goal was really to introduce you to concept art, not necessarily to give you a full rundown, as this is just one workshop out of many that we're holding, and there's really no time to give you a full overview, especially when there's entire classes and courses on those as well, at various places. We do have a couple at UCLA in major restricted classes, unfortunately, but if you do want some extra tips beyond this tutorial, there's a lot of great YouTubers or people on Skillshare, if you're willing to pay for that, who have some really great tutorials. But for now, I just want to give you a couple tips. Focus on communicating ideas efficiently. So we've talked about this a little bit already, but don't worry about perfectionism, because this is all about ideas, not perfection right now. And the sooner you can communicate your idea, the sooner you can move on to the next. And that's something that's really important, especially if you're working in like a really fast-paced studio. I know none of us like crunch, but sometimes that's unfortunately the reality, and you're really going to want to be able to adapt to being able to move on to a new idea quickly, even outside of crunch time, because that's just kind of how you get things flowing. And then also another really great resource is ArtStation. A lot of concept artists who are working in the field, as well as students who are taking, concept art classes or other related classes like production design or animation, or anything like that, post on here. And it's really great to see examples of what other people are doing and what styles they work in. And so it's also really inspiring, I feel, even though it can be really daunting because you look at how gorgeous they are and you think, oh, when will I ever be that good? But I think it is just really great to see a bunch of artists sharing their work for for other people to see, and some of them post like process photos as well. And especially if you find an artist who worked on a game that you've played, it can be really interesting to see how the concept then became a reality and what the differences are. And then we also have some examples of jobs in concept art. I made this slide a while ago and took some of these jobs directly from listings that were available at the time. So you can work full-time at a game studio as a concept artist. A couple of full-time jobs that were listed at the time that I was making these slides were character and creatures concept artist, environment concept artist, concept art manager. I recently was looking into concept art jobs as I will be graduating soon. And I found one at Lucasfilm that I believe was also a part-time position. That one was asking, in addition to the portfolio work and all those qualifications, they were looking for someone with 3 to 5 years at working as a concept artist, preferably at a studio. That obviously being a production design job in film. They were looking at people working at film or theater production studios, but I think they also it just said studio in general, so I think they also were looking at people like and working in games as well, especially since it was Lucasfilm. So yeah, so those are just options, and gives you a little bit of insight into like qualifications. I really recommend, if this is something you're serious about, looking up some of these listings and looking at the qualifications and trying to gear your portfolio towards those. But you can also take contract work, which is not a full-time position necessarily. You might just be working on a project for the length of that project and then move on to somewhere else. A lot of smaller indie studios work this way. And also that tends to be how the film and television industry works as well, if you're interested in that, where you'll be hired onto a project for the length of the project, and then you get another job somewhere else. And of course, your skills can apply to other jobs in other industries, especially depending on, where your background comes from. If you're into animation, you can be an animator, you can do concept art for animation, you can work in the film and television industry, the theater industry, or like where I'm going into personally is the like immersive entertainment, like theme parks and immersive theater sort of thing, which is kind of like a bridge between games and performance. So those are all, many options. You can even, as somebody with a really strong illustration portfolio, apply to be a comic book artist or comic book cover artist. These are all viable jobs that you can have by building your portfolio in these areas as well. So like I said, please share your ideas if you are comfortable and put them into our Discord. But thank you guys for coming. Let me check to see if we have a couple more slides. Yeah, that's it. I think we have a feedback form. Disregard the raffle. I think the feedback might still be happening because we always love to get survey answers. But yeah, go ahead and try scanning that. If you don't, then somebody will probably edit this part out of the video anyway, if you can't use that. So anyway, thank you so much for attending. We really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and please come to some of our in-person tutorials if you can. If you're viewing this way after the school year happened, then, you know, we thank you for watching some of our video tutorials, and please watch some more. Thank you.